Hello and welcome to Human Resources Management. We are going to go over planning in this presentation, and this is Dr. Casper. So what you need to know, what you should remember from this presentation, is how to plan for your people needs to fulfill the organization's strategy. Understand labor demands that are by different categories and your methods to change the labor force up or down. So let's talk about HR planning. First, you have to understand the objectives. Organizations should perform HR planning to meet objectives and gain competitive advantage. But what are your objectives? What is your strategic plan? How many widgets are you going to produce? What is the demand for your product? Then compare whatever that demand is next year. Do you have enough people to meet that demand? Too many people? Or not enough people? And in what areas? So then you compare and identify. Well, we know we need X number of people in this line and Y number of people in that line. So how is it that we're going to meet those goals? What is our strategy? So the HR planning process, very important. You forecast labor demand and you forecast your labor supply within an organization. Maybe you're going to promote a bunch of your phone representatives to managers, and then, but you also have a demand for new managers next year. So as you look at the forecast of demand and supply, you'll come up with forecasting. Do you have labor shortage or labor surplus in each area? Then you set goals and you plan for how you're going to get there, and then you implement and evaluate and do it again. Perhaps you set an HR planning goal for the first quarter and things change dramatically. Well, you need to be able to keep going and make changes as needed. So what is your current state of the human resources? One of the most difficult and perhaps overlooked areas of human resources is how to count heads. I remember talking to the VP of Human Resources for Dell many years ago, and he said that the CEO had come up to him one day and asked, how many people do we have? And he went back to his organization to count. And well, nobody could present a number that matched other people's and that matched the finances. They couldn't count their heads. And he told me they spent months trying to figure out how to get an accurate count on a daily, hourly, monthly basis and to forecast that. Why is that so difficult? In a smaller organization, of course, you're just look around the room, okay, I've got that many people. But in a larger organization, certainly those that have plants overseas and other places, you have to count things such as full-time and part-time employees that work overtime. How do you handle overtime? Part-time employees, how many hours are they working? So FTE, or full-time equivalent, is really used in your labor line on the finances by financial people, folks in the finance organization. How do you count temporaries? Are they 2 temporaries equals 1 full-time because they don't receive benefits? How is it that you're going to deal with or handle temporaries when you're trying to count? What are your turnover rates? So I'm going to put together a number of people at the end of the month. Well, how do I account for those who may be leaving the organization? What is my turnover rate? Internal promotions? Oh, sometimes turnover rates, they always do. They change on a monthly basis. You get less turnover at the end of the year than you do at the beginning of the summer, for example. So sometimes nobody's leaving the organization, but they're getting promoted inside, and that creates a daisy chain effect. How are you counting internal promotions if you're trying to make a head count by department or by area? So, all right, training and development. Do you count people that are in training, that are out being trained? And then I guess finally is the finance people look usually for the FTEs, but as a human resources, you also need to know how many belly buttons or butts and seats that there are. So how do you forecast? How do you forecast how many people that you need? Well, again, determine supply and demand for positions. Once you determine that supply and demand, you can predict how many people you need, what skills they need in what areas, or if you have an overage. If you have an overage, do they have the right KSAs to go to the job, the other areas where you have a shortage? So what are those steps? Forecast the demand, determine the supply, and determine labor surplus or shortage. I guess that is a process that I keep repeating it, but in a sense, you've got to do that for each and every area within the organization. So forecasting. How do we do forecasting? Well, we look at trend analysis, statistical models that help predict how many people we're going to need for the next year based on how many widgets or the services that we're going to provide, what our growth is, or lack of growth, or if we have efficiencies coming online that are going to enable us to do the same or more with less people. So those are basically the leading indicators. And what do you look at? Objective measures, turnover, unemployment rate in the area. What are the objective measures that help you predict your future labor demand? So your supply, here's a matrix. It's a little bit tricky. Let's take a look at it anyway. It's basically the chart that shows individual job categories, and it shows a couple of things. The matrix provides answers to two questions. Where did the people in each job category go? And where did people in each job category today, where did they come from? And you can see the importance of knowing the answers to both of those questions. A little bit complicated here, but let's take a look. If I'm trying to get a marker to work here. Pen. And nope, not going to work. All right, so if we get number 3, the phone representative. Oh, there we go. The phone representative. If we get number 3, the phone representative, and we see that in 2011, they were the ones that were there in 2011, 20% moved to the phone representative. Phone representatives moved to the lead phone representative. Okay, see the 2 there at the top, and then 50% are still in place, and 30% left the organization. In 2013, we go vertical now, and 50% of the phone reps were still phone reps, and 50% of the new ones came from the outside. Call center phone supervisor, line number 1, we see that 95% of them are still in their job, and 5% of them are not in the organization. And if we look over here, we see, well, column 8 shows people who are not in the organization, but if we look over here to column 1, in 2013, 95%. In 2011 or 2013, they came from the same job. None of them moved. And 5% were people who were promoted from the lead phone representative. You may take a few minutes to understand and grasp this particular slide. So once you determine the forecast for demand and supply, and you take a look at your matrix, and understand where the people came from and where the people went to, you can make an accurate assessment of the overage and underage for each job category. And then you make a plan for how you're going to address those challenges. Do you hire, do you fire, or do you do something else? You may have an overage in one area and an underage in another area at the same time. So it's not as simple as saying, I've got too many people, or I've got too little people, or too few people. What do? Well, options for right sizing down, or getting your organization to the right size, it doesn't have to just be firing people or getting rid of people, such as a reduction in force. Maybe you do have a reduction in force. Maybe you have layoffs. Perhaps early retirements. You offer people a package so that they can leave the organization, early retirement. Perhaps you have a hiring freeze, complete hiring freeze across the organization. And maybe you just wait for attrition or turnover to bring your numbers down. Perhaps you've got full-time employees that would want to move to part-time, or you can reduce the overtime in the organization. Sometimes it's suggested to do pay reductions or demotions. So all these are some of the options for decreasing the size of a particular department or an organization. You can also, and certainly, look at moving people from these affected areas to other places in the organization that they're hiring, depending upon their skills and on their abilities. So options for right sizing up. Perhaps you're growing and need more people. Well, you don't always just go out and hire more people. You need more power, more work power. Because there is a certain, although nobody is a full-time permanent employee, there's a certain amount of permanency and cost associated with hiring somebody. It's not always the right answer if you don't have enough people to go out and hire more. Maybe you cover your shortage with overtime, and you can make it mandatory. Perhaps you bring in temporaries that have the right key skills, knowledge, skills, and ability. Perhaps you outsource some of the work and hire organizations or contractors to help you out. I mentioned before about retraining transfers. Try to do turnover reduction to keep the people in the organization. And then finally, and most certainly, you can hire people into those jobs in which you can justify additional hires. So you also have affirmative action. And affirmative action goals require that employers carry out an additional level of HR planning that are aimed at these goals. Now, affirmative action is not a quota system, but you do need to look at the representation of subgroups in your labor force and make sure you're not perhaps causing having trouble with that word today, causing underrepresented areas within your affirmative action plan, disparate impact through your hiring. So you do a workforce utilization review. You do a comparison of employees in protected groups with the proportion that each group represents in the relevant labor market. That you do as an ongoing part of your affirmative action plan. If you have underutilization of certain job category groups, certain minority protected status groups in certain jobs, then goals and a plan needs to be established of how you might go out and increase the number of those protected class individuals in your hiring pool. And again, no quotas for the most part, forcing organizations to hire the minority groups that aren't qualified or don't have the skill sets. yet you must make affirmative action, positive steps to try to recruit individuals from your community at a rate that matches the protected class's percentage of the population. All right, so we talked about HR planning in this presentation and how it becomes a little bit tricky and difficult as you look at each of the areas of your organization and each of the jobs and try to forecast growth or decline in need for your product. And it is a pretty tricky thing to try to calculate on an hourly basis or a monthly basis or weekly basis what your numbers are. And generally your labor line is the biggest line on the spreadsheets. So how you manage your human resources is a critical factor in the success of any organization. So again, Human Resources 6302. Thank you for joining me today. This is Dr. Casper signing off.